Hello, I'm Lyndon Baker, and I'm standing in front of one of Rochester's largest industrial properties, JHP Pharmaceuticals, located on Parke-Davis Street. It's had various names over the years. For example, it was Pfizer at one time. Before that, it was Warner Lambert. But most people in the area still refer to it as Parke-Davis. Many of us drive past this facility every day, but few of us really know of the historical significance of this facility. There's a lot of local history in this company that we wanted to preserve. So Pat McKay invited retirees out to the museum to talk about life at Parke-Davis. Here's a look.
All right, we're going to talk about the animals first at Parke-Davis, because that's where Parke-Davis was known for, was that a lot of the experiments had to take place on animals. Now, our list at the museum shows that the animals on the farm were the pigs, sheep, fowl, rabbits, monkeys, cattle, horses, and guinea pigs. So let's start with some of your experiences on the farm and running a biological farm. What's your experiences?
Well, what was very interesting to me when I first hired in was talking to the older guys, the employees that had been there for a long time. And I'd worked with the horses starting back in the 30s. And they would get a trainload of horses. They'd come in boxcars from out west. These were wild range horses, and they would unload these horses, take them over to the dip barn. They had to dip them, totally submerge them in this concrete trough in the floor of this barn. And I can just imagine what they were doing with these wild horses, trying to get these things submerged and into the trough, and then take them up the hill and put them installed in the barn. And I've got horses now, you know, if I have to deal with one bad horse a day, that's a lot of work. And these guys did it for 8 hours a day for 35 cents an hour, which just amazed me. I don't think I could have done it. In the wintertime, when they didn't have much to do, they'd dig post holes in the frozen ground with spuds. They had spud post holes, put the concrete posts in that we used. And I just can't imagine that either. Those guys they earned their money. That was hard work.
So was horses mainly what you worked with? Were there other animals there?
Well, I worked with monkeys. Yeah, we harvested monkeys for the polio vaccine. I would start out catching monkeys, and I ended up managing people like these three mechanics here.
Tried to.
The monkeys came in from India on airplane.
Yeah, they had some African and some from India also. And they flew them in. When we got them into the plant, we would have to give them a TB test, see if any of them had TB, and they injected them with vitamins to build them up. And then they fed them a lot of Purina, monkey chow, and bananas. They were very well taken care of. We had inspectors came from India and Africa to see how they were treated, make sure they were treated properly. But they got the best of care, same as the horses or any other animals.
Did the animals ever escape? I thought I heard rumors of monkeys in the trees in Rochester. Is there any
true.
substantiated rumors of that?
I couldn't verify that.
Yeah,
That
they
is
did.
true.
They said that the police department in Rochester used up their whole year's supply of ammunition trying to get those monkeys.
Now, the good news I've heard about the animals is that the animals at Parke-Davis were the best kept animals. I mean, the stalls were vermin-free, it was dust-free. But all the animals stayed within. They were never released. They were never let go again.
No.
They were used on the farm, and then they were destroyed.
Everything had to be incinerated.
Everything had to be.
The farm.
So
the horses weren't kept out here necessarily to do farm work per se. They were used to produce antitoxins. There was diphtheria, tetanus, clostridia, varieties of toxin would be sent out here to Parkdale. They'd be injected into the horses. When they reached a certain titer or level of antibodies, they would be bled, and that blood or plasma would be sent into Detroit for purification.
So were you any of you involved in the bleeding of the horses then?
I wasn't involved with the bleeding. I was involved with toxin production and purification when it went when the plasma was sent to Detroit.
Okay, let's talk more about the bleeding of the horses.
They were bled every 2 weeks. And I forget how many
9 liters, I think, came out.
But they put a thing in the neck of the horse and bled it. And then he would rest for 2 days. Then they'd start injecting him again in the shoulder. They put the toxin in their shoulders with 40 pounds of air pressure, which was probably painful for the horse. But they produce a lot of toxin. And my understanding when I first hired in, the flagpole on the hill where the office was, there was a horse buried there that produced 1 million doses of toxin for World War II.
Okay, that may be Tess, one of the horses that we
Yes.
have recognized, I think, in our.
Excuse me, but
Go ahead.
probably several people here have copies of the history of Parkdale that was written covering the years of 1908 to 1988. And the whole, it's a huge section discussing the animals, and they specifically mentioned Tess and how she was honored by a special, burial place, etc. But if you really want to get a lot of details, aside from relying on our excellent memories here, you might want to reference that booklet later.
So you're saying Tess was buried up where the flagpole is?
Oh, yeah.
Property.
When I hired in, and the pole was there, but there's a little plaque honoring the horse.
Okay.
And produced 1 million doses. I don't know what's there now. I have no idea.
I'd heard that one horse paid for the whole farm. That's what I had heard. I don't know if that was true or not. Then when the horse died, they skinned him for the leather and made all the horsemen mad.
There's various vaccines that we can talk about. Our records show diphtheria, scarlet fever, tetanus, smallpox, anthrax, and seasonal flu. But let's talk about polio. I mean, certainly polio is one of the vaccines that changed America. I mean, kids growing up in the 1940s, 50s have a different idea of going to the beach today than they would have when you guys were either young children yourself or raising your own families. So let's talk about the polio vaccine. And Dr. Beardmore, do you want to start off and talk about how Parke-Davis became involved in the polio vaccine and connection with Jonas Salk?
Yeah, of course, the basic research came out of Harvard University where they discovered that you could grow polio virus in epithelial cells rather than nerve cells. And Jonas Salk was a bright young researcher at, I believe he was at Michigan at the time, then he went to the University of Pittsburgh, and he picked up on this, and he could see that this was a breakthrough for the development of a vaccine. So he did a lot of basic work, and he was a consultant and collaborator with Parke-Davis and Company. And he had done some very small-scale clinical tests, and they looked very promising. And Parke-Davis agreed with Salk that they would manufacture his vaccine for clinical testing in the United States. And at that time, they hired me, a relative neophyte, to work with Salk. I met with him a number of times in his laboratories, and we started making the vaccine, and we had some technical problems, and he did very small laboratory work. So anyway, we decided we would go ahead with this, and with Eli Lilly, another big manufacturer, to make all the vaccine in the country. Well, everybody had troubles. It was not an easy vaccine to make, and we built the new buildings. I don't know how many buildings we built out here at Parkdale for the purpose of making and testing the vaccine. In 1954, we started manufacturing. The vaccine was licensed in 1955, and we produced that for about 10 years when the Sabin oral vaccine came along, and we got out of the business because we were afraid that there might be some reversion to the virulent form that might cause polio. And indeed, this has happened in the world, and the vaccine is now used in this country is all the Salk formaldehyde inactivated vaccine, And we are not using in the United States the oral vaccine anymore.
So how often was Dr. Salk at the Parkdale Pharmaceutical Labs here in Rochester?
Never.
Oh, he was never here?
No. This was all done in virus research in Detroit. And, I would say, I met him, I would say 3 times in Detroit, and then I went to Pittsburgh a couple of times into his laboratories and worked with him. And it was, someone else would have done it if Salk hadn't, but he was smart enough and determined enough to push it through, and he saved an untold number of lives by what he did. So I think he deserves a tremendous amount of credit.
All right, Evie, you talked about an exciting time when, just as you were joining the Parke-Davis staff. Tell us about the exciting times as the polio vaccine was being distributed and created.
Well, number one, just the volume of new people there coming from, they were recruited from campuses all over the country. You know, young people coming in, and just the social aspects of that was exciting for a new graduate from college. But it was full-time work, you know, and I personally was working on filling tissue culture bottles with a suspension of the live virus. This is before the end of the process where it's inactivated. And then those tissue cultures with the virus in them would be placed in an incubator for a certain period of time to allow for growth of the virus, you know. And after they had really destroyed the whole tissue culture, that was time to harvest them. And those suspensions of virus were moved on to the processing labs where they were filtered to clean them up. And then they went through the inactivation process and the testing process, etc. So this was amazingly broadening for someone who majored in biology and chemistry out of Marygrove College in Detroit, a good school but a small school, you know. And we all felt very proud to be part of that project. And it was just by chance that we ended up there, you know, because I lived in Pontiac all my life, and this is nearby here, and that I was able to find a job like that so close to home, and to meet such interesting people like Dr. Beardmore, for example. And I didn't realize that you had that extensive background with Dr. Salk. It's just very interesting to me.
Were you all aware that you were doing a world-changing event, that you were part of something that was solving a worldwide crisis at that time with the polio vaccine?
I don't know that I realized it at the time. I realized it 2 to 3 years later when we saw the curves for the effectiveness of the vaccine and how the cases of polio just dropped off dramatically. Yeah, then I was impressed, not with myself, but that I was able to be part of such a humongous contribution. And I think that stands out in my mind as the most important thing that I ever did in my work life.
They talk about, even in the Rochester area, they had kids who became what was called polio pioneers, where they were distributed, you know, either the medicine or as Dr. Salk was first testing it, you know, the placebo to see if it was going to work through their testing. Were any of you involved in that distribution, or even with your children? Were they involved as polio pioneers, getting the first inoculations? Did you see that side of the?
You're talking about clinical trials?
Clinical trials?
I think we all took the Parke-Davis vaccine at one time or the other. In fact, I worked for Chuck Kupsky. He was one of the managers. I worked in the labs before I got out of production, filtering the live polio vaccine. And I know we took the injection, and that's when it was in its infancy.
Mm-hmm. So you were kind of a polio pioneer in your own way.
Well, yeah, it didn't kill me, so it was good. You know, I was probably one of the first monkeys they tested.
They talk about others. So we'll move on from polio. They talked about diphtheria, scarlet fever, tetanus, smallpox, anthrax, and seasonal flu. Did any of you work on those other vaccines?
Everybody.
Smallpox was done on cattle. I go through what I remember, we turned the cattle up on a machine. So their butt or something was in there. We shaved them, scratched them, put the smallpox vaccine in those wounds, and we kept them on their feet for 7 days. Then they harvested the smallpox off the thing, and they destroyed them. And the old barn is still there now. It's falling apart, but it's still there.
Okay. That was for the smallpox vaccine?
Yes.
And that's always was on the cattle. So each animal kind of tested a different vaccine that was being worked on at Parke-Davis? The guinea pigs would be used for something, the rabbits, all the different...
It was
The small animals were used for testing of the vaccines. The larger animals, such as Joe described, were actually for producing the vaccine. For example, the horses or the cows. I think those are the only two animals that I can think of that were used for making a product from.
Well, the
Well, they
monkeys,
used rabbits, made rabies vaccine
Oh, they
with
did?
rabbit brains.
Oh, okay, I didn't realize that.
and the monkeys' kidneys were used for the making the polio vaccine. That's what the virus was grown on,
Yeah, of
the
course.
kidney cells.
And of course, millions of eggs.
Right,
Yeah.
right, millions of eggs for flu.
Talk about the eggs. Where did the eggs come? Where do you get 1,000,000 eggs?
All over the state
Well,
of Michigan, I think.
there was about five, oh, excuse me, Tom.
Oh, we had farms lined up from Pennsylvania to Iowa. And we'd haul in 250,000 eggs a day, 7 days a week, once flu started. And we'd incubate the eggs for 11 days, inject them with a flu virus. Depending on the virus, you'd put them back in the virus incubator for 2 to 3 days at a different temperature. And after that, once the virus grew in the egg, we would take the eggs out and handle them again. Where they run down, everything was automated. We had 6,600 eggs on a truck. They went into a machine that unloaded the eggs out of the truck and put them on conveyors.
Were monkey kidneys involved in polio vaccine?
Yes,
Yeah.
Oh,
that's
definitely.
the virus.
I have a purchasing story. The airplanes that came in from India and Africa landed at Willow Run Airport. Bill Knapp was the purchasing agent in
Right.
charge of egg buying and monkeys. And at the airport out at Willow Run, our men had long aprons and big boots. And every now and then, one of the monkeys would get out, and they'd have to chase them down the runway with these heavy aprons. And were you involved in that? Or?
Only the concerns of a purchasing agent I could see.
When polio first started in 56, everything was done in Building 8. All the testing, all the way through, glassware prepared and all of that, and even pooled there. The polio pooling was there in Building 8. Safety test, all of that.
There's some history about Building 8 too, that the beams for that building were an interception from Mackinac Bridge, was it?
Right, the government intercepted that steel.
And brought it here to make this building to produce the polio. So the bridge took second place.
Okay, all right. We talked a little bit about the vaccines and the animals. Did any of you work on the raising of the crops on the field? Our records show corn, alfalfa, cabbage, beets, hay, oats, bran, and foxglove. But even the only controversial plant I know of is that marijuana was grown on the farm for medical purposes. Were any of you involved in the farming operation? Up to 700 acres at one point were under cultivation. I know we worked with the animals. Did anybody work with the farming part of it?
I wasn't, but I had a man that worked for me. His name is Ray Plassey. He retired, I think, in 1970 something. But when he retired, he had worked at Parke-Davis out here 40 years. So he was here when they grew all the plants, and then a lot of that was produced for the small animals downtown Detroit. I wish he was here to tell you about it, but.
So were just big animals out in Rochester, and the small animals were in Detroit?
No, we had all
You had all of them.
sizes.
Okay.
Parkdale.
So tell me what happened. What was the connection in Detroit? What was going on in Detroit? Is that a laboratory there, or is that where they were taking products and blood from this farm, and then what was happening in Detroit? What was the two the connection between
Well, they were
Parke-Davis and
taking
Detroit?
all of the plasma from the horses, producing antitoxin, which counteracted tetanus, diphtheria, and some of the anaerobic toxins. The smallpox vaccine was harvested and sent into Detroit, where it was filled into small needles along with another needle containing a sterile, or shouldn't say needles, but little glass tubes. And a needle accompanied the vaccine, also in a tube, and that was marketed. It was only good for 3 months on the market.
And where was that laboratory in Detroit? Was it right on the Detroit
It was
River?
up on the 6th floor.
Jefferson
That was the
Avenue.
world headquarters for Parke-Davis and
Yeah.
Company.
So where was that in Detroit? What's,
On Jefferson Avenue.
Joseph Campo at the
Joseph
river, the
Campo.
most famous name in pharmaceutical history, or most famous address. And when I started there in 1960, Parke-Davis was the largest pharmaceutical company in the world, with branches in most of the non-communist countries. When I left in '68, we were 10th largest. Honest, I didn't have anything to do with that.
Well, Parke-Davis holds #1
Biological
license for it, making vaccines.
let's talk about the different buildings. You guys are rattling off building numbers. And so y'all didn't work in the same building, but tell me about the different buildings, and some of them were I had to be completely sterile that when you would walk into it. But tell me about different buildings and what happened in the various buildings and their numbers for somebody who's never worked at Parke-Davis.
Well, in the Building 8, which is the main building that they produced the polio in, every room was scrubbed from top to bottom every day with a disinfectant. And all the floors were mopped every day, so everything was completely sterile. You'd never find a hospital today in that situation.
That's for sure.
How did you sterilize the employees when they walked in? So they weren't bringing in molds or bacteria in with them on their shoes, or was there any kind of precautions? Did they have to change clothes before they entered the building?
We wore gowns, Tyvek suits, working in the polio labs. And our protection against the polio vaccine was a surgical mask with the strings hanging loose.
At that time, it was important to observe cleanliness, but keep in mind that when the virus suspension was prepared finally after all these human beings had been working with it, it was filtered to sterilize it. So through filters that would filter out any bacterial type of contamination. So we ended up with a sterile product, but it was a clean process
Right.
up to the point of sterilization by filtration.
Yeah. When we made a connection from the big tanks to the bottles when we were filtering, we done it over a Brunson burner. And you wore the rubber gloves for cleanliness and sterility. And you done all these connections over this fire, over the flame. And it's kind of crude at today's methods, but at that time it worked. It's what we had to work with.
All right, that's building 8. There's more.
Well, our last building, Building 100, that was a state-of-the-art building when it was completed. We had 21 air handling systems in the building. And each air handling system was set to work at a specific static pressure, with air handlers 1 and 2 would feed the sterile core. And those air handlers were equipped with HEPA filters. And they were 99.999% purify the air. And these things were tested twice a year with smoke, and we had to scan the downstream side to make sure there were no pinholes or any leaks of any kind. But it was a real job. Bruce was involved in keeping the air handling systems balanced throughout the building to ensure sterility in the core. Then you had the lid-free area, which was your next highest static pressure area, where stuff was prepped before it went into the sterile core. So it was quite involved. It was one of the most modern pharmaceutical building for quite some time after we built it.
That was built what year? 79?
I can't remember when it was built. It
Pretty
was,
close to about that time.
Yeah, it was around 79 when they,
it's when I started thinking
Started.
about
But you
retiring.
have to remember now, that was all
Production.
intended for final product.
Mm-hmm.
It had nothing to do with this early harvesting that we're talking about.
So that's from a cleanliness standpoint. How about from a security standpoint? Were there lots of, were you in a fairly highly secure laboratory? Did they treat it that way? Were you subjected to security clearances?
I remember back when we first went to work there, you could be working in the hallway someplace, and here comes this stranger walking down. What are you doing in here? You know, you better get out of here. Well, there were really no security to speak of, but then security really got tight. It was kind of comical in a way.
After we built 100, they had some narcotic products, not very many. I don't think we could justify what the expense for security or from the profit we made from the narcotics. But the guardhouse would take a round from a tank, supposedly. And we only had a small, I forget what product it was even, it wasn't much. It was narcotics, so. We had, and everyone had cards and badges. We had, to clear an area, you had to have a badge to open the door and get into the areas in 100.
You mentioned narcotics. In terms of, we never sold marijuana. We sold cannabis USP. USP is U.S. Pharmacopoeia, which is the basic standard in the pharmaceutical industry. But we did not sell marijuana. Same thing.
Grew up the same plant.
Let's talk about some of the personalities there. A couple of names that I've heard. Dr. Mockamer was there as a director of research. Somebody mentioned Earl Dean and Dr. Holcomb. Tell me about some of the people who helped run, who may have been the supervisors and the bosses of Parke-Davis and their personalities, if you could say nice things about your supervisors.
Well, there's a group you haven't touched on yet, and there's nobody here to represent them, but all the time when there were animals here, there were veterinarians that had charge of animal care and so on.
You're right, we don't even have lists of names of the veterinarians that would have been.
Dr. Van Acker.
Dr. Van Acker.
I got a story about
Wilson.
Doctor. They shipped some animals from Michigan State that had windows in their side. I don't know what for, but they just shipped them out here. So I was taking care of them, and Dr. Van Acker came down one Sunday morning to check them out. So as we were leaving, this one ram with a window on the side, we were just ready to go through the gate. This ram got Dr. Van Acker right in the butt. And knocked me into the gate, knocked his glasses off. So, but he was a good doctor. I liked him.
Yeah, we'll keep going.
The doctors, I think that started was Dr. Wilson, was one of the older, and under him, I think, was Dr. Smead. And then came Dr. Van Acker, Dr. Ayers, was all in the veterinary section.
Mentioning Dr. Wilson, I had occasion to talk to Dr. Wilson, and he was quite a guy. I really enjoyed talking to him. He was very instrumental in getting Crittenden Hospital started. But his name is nowhere up in Crittenden Hospital I've ever found. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of disappointing to me. That's when it was in its infancy and they were just talking about it. But he was quite a guy. I think in those personnel records, his name is in there, and he was hired in 1885 or something like that by Parke-Davis.
At one point in the time of Parkdale, there was a home for the veterinarian on the site. In fact, when Dr. Ayers left and they no longer needed a veterinarian, he was surprised at the high cost of living because he had not experienced it in 30 years.
Wasn't Earl Dean born in the home on the?
I don't know.
I think he was Parkdale, the house.
Well, when I started in 1956, across from the entrance gate of Parkdale, there was two homes. One, I think, was Earl Dean's on the left. The other one was a guy by the name of Mike Cromie. And Mike Cromie, one day we come into work and we heard that he had died. The house caught on fire, and his dog, he had a coal stove, and his dog tore off all the blinds trying to get out of that house, but they both, the dog and Mike Cromie, perished there. Smoke.
You talked briefly about the fire department. Did Parke-Davis have its own fire protection service, or did they rely on the Rochester Fire Department? or-
I think they did, but I don't know much about that, maybe someone else.
They did have their own fire department. There was only about 5 people, I believe. And that's all they done. They patrolled the plant, and they had keys, they had the wine, that's part of security too, to make sure that they'd been there, you know. In fact, that box that I brought you was from Parke-Davis Fire Department.
They had a drill every so often, every 3 or 4 weeks, and they had an old hand pump machine. And they'd roll that thing around and pretend there's a fire. It was comical, but
Another thing too, I think Parke-Davis gave the ground where the water tower is here, they gave that to the town.
They did, yes.
And also, there used to be, I've heard now, you'll come in on this, a siren that used to go off every day
At noon, right.
at noon.
yeah.
And you have that siren?
No.
I brought the box in that the button was in. When the contractor tore it down, I asked him if I could have it, and he said, yeah, take it. And it shows it says Parke-Davis Fire Department. It had the button in it you pushed for the siren. And Rochester at that time didn't have a siren. So we had, if a storm come, we had to signal Rochester with our siren. It was on barn 20, wasn't it, or barn 1? On top. Made a lot of noise.
You all sound like you liked working for Parke-Davis. It sounds like there was a community atmosphere, and our records show that there were picnic grounds. They
Yes.
had a couple of clubs, a good fellowship club, a gun club. Tell us about work outside of work, you know? Was there a social network?
Well, they
They
actually,
had strong social activity. Probably most of it was downtown, but they had, I don't know how many ball clubs, bowling leagues,
Ski club.
ski clubs, they had travel clubs, they had card clubs, performance clubs put on plays. They had
A good deal of that would be in that Parke-Davis reviews. Up until 1960, all of Parke-Davis was downtown except for Rochester. In 1960, they opened research in Ann Arbor. And then in 79, they moved sterile products out here to Rochester. Otherwise, sterile products were done in Detroit. The biologic part was done here, but the finishing was all done in Detroit.
Yeah. We had the Holland, Michigan chemical plant.
Okay, that's right.
back then.
Now that only, Dick Keenman was in Detroit. That the chemical works were right across from the personnel building at one time.
Yeah,
When did they move?
Well, when I came in 1960, Holland had been there for a while, so
Okay.
I don't know.
Yeah.
The other event that happened here at Parkdale was the company picnic. All the Detroiters and Parkdale-ites, researchers from Ann Arbor, or maybe the Holland people, came in the summer, and we had a grand picnic on the grounds
It happened every summer?
every
Yes,
summer.
yeah.
I've got a review here that talks about a lot of the picnics were held out here. That you can see.
Were they held right on the grounds of Parke-Davis? Or did they eventually outgrow the grounds and have to be used at other area parks?
no.
Or always on the
They had a
grounds?
state-of-the-art picnic grounds. It's down just on this side of the bridge. If you went over the railroad tracks, it had a full ball diamond. It had a pavilion. It had hot and cold water running in the johns. It had a skeet and a trap chute. It had everything you wanted there.
Is there any of that still standing?
No, it's a forest now.
It
Yeah.
is?
No,
Okay.
that was separate from the Parke-Davis facility, Parkdale facility itself.
Now, my understanding is that they allowed other area groups to use that
Right.
too. They,
That
sounds
was
like
all
they were-
Parke-Davis.
You're all part of a good community citizen. Well, then at some point, Parke-Davis changed names. It went from different names that I know of, King Pharmaceutical, Warner Lambert, JHP, and it's Parkdale Pharmaceutical now. So were you part of that as it changed names and ownership? So how was that? How did it change for you as an employee there?
Well, we were all worried. When Parke-Davis, we heard they were gonna merge or be sold out by Warner Lambert, which happened in the 70s, I think, some 75, 70-something there.
Actually, Warner Lambert acquired Parke-Davis.
Yeah, really, yeah.
And then, of course, Warner Lambert was acquired by Pfizer.
Pfizer.
So we are all retirees of Pfizer in one way or another.
Pfizer acquisition was 2000.
Okay, more recent one.
The Warner Lambert acquisition took almost 7 years to get approval from the federal government. And now these approvals come in 3 to 6 months.
Yeah.
But you sounds like your loyalty's back to Parke-Davis.
I think most people identify themselves as
Yes.
Parke-Davis.
Because you hired in as Parke-Davis employees.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they sold all the property out here at one time, and the employees were all very upset, hoping that, why didn't they offer it to us, you know, to buy? Because, gee, there's $600,000 homes out there right across from the plant that was built, you know. And I don't know what year that was, 70-something.
You know, going back with Parke-Davis, it's kind of everybody knew everybody. There was a guy lived on Parkdale just before you get to Twitter. And he got sick. He worked for Parke-Davis. I'm not sure what happened, but he couldn't work, and he had a mentally disturbed son. So George Smith and Earl Dean would have me at night haul coal to that guy so he could heat the house. Eventually it tore it down, but I thought that was pretty nice. He couldn't even heat his house. I would haul coal at night and keep my mouth shut down to him.
It was a family-oriented company, you know, you have fathers, sons, brothers, aunts, uncles, all working for Parke-Davis.
The same was true in Detroit. It was a family.
Yeah.
And the bonding between Parke-Davis, Detroit, and Parkdale was there. It wasn't as strong because of the distance, but we were all part of the same family.
Well, I think there's a lot of jealousy too. You people in Detroit used to call it the country club.
That's very true.
And you were.
See?
Keep telling us other stories.
At one time, I hired a retired engineer from Detroit. He worked in Detroit for 49 years. Phil Ayulo was his name. And Phil's parents worked at Parke-Davis at the river. And his mother would take him to work with her. She was an inspector. She inspected capsules. She worked at this long table with a bunch of other women. And he would play under the table all day long while she inspected capsules.
With FDA approval.
And so then Phil came to work for the company, worked another 49 years. So he got almost, and his father had 40-some years. So he had almost 100 years history between the father and son working for the company. And when I asked my girlfriend to marry me, Parke-Davis had such a good name around Utica that her father said, "You work at Parke-Davis?" And he took a liking to me right away. He knew I could support her.
Now, did a lot of you settle in the Rochester area? I know Utica sounds like Utica, Pontiac.
Shelby Township.
Shelby?
I'm from Shelby, just short ways across. Romeo.
I was born in Pontiac, so I didn't come here and settle in Pontiac. So I was just fortunate to find work so close to home, you know. But a lot of people came from all over the country to work here too, especially among our technicians.
That one fellow came from Ohio State, right? We let him in.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Hey, they're still in the tournament.
Oh, very good.
When I was being interviewed for the job, I was up in the cafeteria, Building 8. That's where the cafeteria was. And Bob Casello, I believe it's his name.
Casello.
He was interviewing me, and we're going through the interview, and all of a sudden he said, "Look, go in there. Hear a bunch of the guys riding horses." Went by, and I said, "I'll take the job." Yeah, they rode the horses from the barn right by the cafeteria.
Incidentally, they weren't supposed to do that.
Dr. Hook was the manager at that time, and he was sitting there, and he laughed. We saw it several times. They'd ride by it. He'd just laugh about it. Nobody got hurt, and it was all fun, part of a day's work.
Many of you talked about a career that spanned somewhere between 25 and maybe 35 years. What were the changes that you see in your career, both at Parke-Davis and in the Rochester community?
Paperwork.
Oh,
If you didn't handle at least 15 pounds of paper a day, you didn't earn your money at the end.
everything that was done had to be signed. You had to, if I went into a lab and as much as changed a light bulb, you had to write that down. Everything was under FDA control, and it was very strict. Any machine I worked on, like in Building 100, I spent more time doing the paperwork than I did actually doing the work, and dressing to go in a sterile core. To maybe it would take me 30 minutes to dress, to put on the Tyvek suit and the gloves, and go through the sterile procedure to go in and do a 2-minute job. It'd take me 30 minutes to go in and 15 minutes to come out. And but I guess it paid off in sterility, because I don't know if we ever had much problems with sterility, but it was very strict. It was one of the hardest part of the job is changing clothes 5 times a day to go into sterile core to make an adjustment on a freeze dryer or even a temperature control.
What stories do you want us to tell the next generation who lives in Rochester today and in the future about the role of Parke-Davis?
Well, it was kind of a tough place to work, especially maintenance. We were on call around the clock. And when flu was running, that was 7 days a week, and around the clock, we had maintenance guys in flu and in the buildings. And there was a lot of headaches, but I remember the day I retired, I sat in my office thinking about it before I walked out. I'm glad I worked there instead of making nuts and bolts, because what we did made the quality of life better for a lot of people. So it was worth the hassle. It was worth the aggravation. And these guys did a lot.
Yeah.
Everybody at this table did an awful lot to do that.
Well, what they learned in the space age industry with air handling systems and filtration systems, that had a profound effect on the pharmaceutical industry, because they had developed the technology, and then once it was developed, the FDA and so on said, okay, you've got to go this route, have certain classifications of purification of air, and that really made a big effect on the maintenance area, the air handling systems, water purification.
Sometimes in the winter, there wasn't too much to do on the farm. So they had us cutting down trees that had died, me and Leo Farmer. So we cut down a tree that had a hole in the center. At the bottom was a hole where the mice had run it out. So Leo poured gasoline in a stump. Then he put a big can over the top of the stump. Had to get a trail of gas going back out, so you threw a match in the gas. It went to the stump, exploded, and that thing went in the air, and Rochester Fire Department couldn't find out where it came from. And then, of course, me and Leo didn't say anything. That was a good side of things.
You mentioned the changes we saw in Rochester. I worked there for 39 years. And I thought Rochester was one of the neatest little towns. I came from the South. I came from North Carolina. After I got out of service, I came here and went to work for Parke-Davis. Only job I ever had. And I thought Rochester was the neatest town. I don't think there was more than 2 stoplights on Main Street. The old wooden hotel was still there on the corner of what's now University, was Walton Boulevard and Rochester Road. Earl Dean, our plant manager, owned that hotel. And it was sitting empty. I don't know if they ever rented rooms, but there was a restaurant in the bottom part of the hotel. And I know when you walked in, you kind of got a feeling like you'd been in a bar because you was walking sideways. The floor was tilted. But I've seen a lot of changes in Rochester itself. As far as I know, when the school was built out here off of Walton Boulevard, the subdivisions around Rochester, it was very ghost town-like, you know, just the city and the houses along University up to where Crittenden Hospital is, and down Parkdale Road there, and that's it. As far as homes, the people, there was very few people in Rochester. I don't know what the population was, but
You watched the town grow up.
I sure did.
When we come in from downtown Detroit area, there was a big restaurant, I can't tell you the name of it, in Rochester. I think it was the only one on Main Street. And all of us would go in there and have breakfast or coffee or whatever. Also in there would be the township people. They used to go around a big round table there and meet. That's where they'd have their meetings, the town people.
Was that Bill Knapp's?
No, it wasn't Bill Knapp's. It was a big restaurant though, right on Main Street on the east side, about the middle of town. I can't remember the name of it.
I remember that.
I had a question about Earl Dean. Wasn't he Justice of the Peace in Rochester?
Yes, he was. Earl Dean was quite the guy. When I hired in, I wanted to buy a car in 1957, in fact it was. I wanted to buy a 57 Ford. So I went in, I had to go talk to Earl Dean about getting a loan through the credit union that was downtown. And Earl Dean called Mabel. She was over the credit union downtown, said, I got an employee here that wants to buy a car. He needs a loan. She said, has he got a co-signer? Earl Dean said, yeah, me.
Okay, I hear about Parke-Davis employees. They were involved not only as a village president in Rochester, they were involved in the Masonic Lodge. And so some of the Parke-Davis employees were pretty active throughout the whole community. So Dr. Smead, I think, was one of them.
Yes, he was
involved
Mason.
in the
I'm a
Masonic
Mason. I went to the Rochester Lodge there many times, and at that time, a lot of the police department in Rochester belonged to the Mason.
George Smith gave me a slip of paper to fill out. I had to go to Detroit to hire in. The man down there, I can't remember who it was. I gave him a piece of paper. He said, George Smith and Earl Dean recommend you. That's all I need. You're hired.
That was the application.
That was it.
Probably was Kinsella.
It was
Did the
Bob
hiring.
Kinsella.
I don't know who it was.
I had a question about horses. As a scientific buyer, I bought the cannula or needle that they stuck in the neck. It's about as big around as your finger, and I was told that the horses recognized that and reacted. Did you have that experience?
Yeah.
They used to cry, didn't they, Joe?
Yeah, it was, we had three guys who were good at doing that. Lonnie had, Chet Wilsey, and Chet DeVault. All three were good at that. And, but sometimes a horse, when they got in front of them, put that in the jugular vein, they would, I don't think it was that painful, they just, I knew what was coming.
Joe was probably on a talking basis with a lot of horses.
Well, yeah.
I think, you can correct me, but I think when I hired in 56, there were 45 horses at Parkdale. I don't know how many sheep or whatever, but there was 45 horses, I remember.
So what's the most
And one,
number of
and I don't
horses?
know the name, is buried up there at the flagpole.
Yeah,
What's the most number of horses you had at one time?
Oh, they had more back in World War I area. A lot of horses, hundreds, I guess.
you know, they had many of them. But my end counter, most we had was 45.
45 horses.
World War I, wasn't Parkdale gas gangrene antitoxin, and was that drawn from horses?
Well, they're a big producer of it. Trouble is, people got allergic to horse sale. And that kind of defeated the whole purpose.
Oh, well, I think of it, I'm off base here a little bit, but they had a big drying house where they dried digitalis and marijuana.
Cannabis.
So they decided to make that room a cafeteria. That was the first cafeteria out here. So I had me and a couple other guys go up in the attic to clean this place. It was so strong up there from all the marijuana and digitalis, we got dizzy up there. it was really weird. But they cleaned, we got it all clean, and that was the first cafeteria out here.
Now, what building was that in?
Wasn't that where the,
It's tall, but it's where the union took over.
I don't know what building.
That's where the union took
28.
over.
28?
Building 28.
Building 28, yeah, that's right.
It's that little one
Yeah.
across the street. Yeah.
It was George Smith's office at one time, too.
But it was weird. It was up there cleaning, and I got dizzy. I couldn't figure out what was wrong. And I guess fumes off that was what done it.
As we wrap up our interview today, what was the saddest part when you had to leave Parke-Davis?
leaving the people.
The people,
The
absolutely.
people. Oh, it was just like a family, a big family. That's what you can say, you know. Everybody knew everybody. They were friends. They married. A lot of them married.
Yeah.
Whatever. It's just the people.
We have at least 3 groups that get together for luncheons once a month. It's probably more from other spots.
Scott, being a member of the Grand Army of the Republic, we don't have much of a future, but we have, the one I attend, we have 30 to 40 each month. And 343 months we've met. Something like
That's been meeting for 30 years. So-
Wow.
And it was what, 80 to 100 people
Yeah.
every month. Now it's down to about 40.
I
that.
didn't-
Can't grow.
What are you saddest about when you reflect back on leaving Parke-Davis?
Well, I don't think I was sad about leaving Parke-Davis, but I think the one thing, as all of these people with many more years than I had have spoken, it was the people. It was when I first hired in here. Genther was the man's name who hired me in at Parkdale. It was all a family relationship. And that tainted my experience in other employment. It was never the same quite again. And I think the setting of Parkdale and Rochester at the time, growing up in Romeo, 50s and 60s, and Rochester was another little community that is quite different today. It's been probably 20 years since I've been to Rochester, and I wouldn't know where I was at today. I mean, just a different place. But I think the people that you met and the people that you worked with, they all had stories, they were all involved. They just didn't come to a job. And that was remarkable. I left here and went to France. I lived in France, went to school there, but it's never been quite the same as years here at Parkdale.
Well, we hope you've enjoyed listening to the stories of Parke-Davis. We'll leave you with a story from our own archives of the Parke-Davis barns. I'm Lyndon Baker. Thanks for watching.
Hi, I'm Pat McKay. I'm the Supervisor of Interpretive Services at the Rochester Hills Museum. And we're at a very historic location here in Rochester as we look at some of the Parke-Davis barns that were built in the early 1900s. I'd like to take you on a tour of some of the barns and explain some of the history of this fabulous facility. Follow me. In 1903, Parke-Davis Pharmaceutical Company was given biological license number 1 to develop serums. By 1907, they decided to relocate their animal production plants from downtown Detroit out into the ruralness of southeastern Michigan, and they chose this site here in Rochester when they purchased 320 acres of farmland. Now, people might wonder why a pharmaceutical company would be so concerned about buying farmland out in the wilderness of Michigan, basically. And the reason why Parke-Davis bought it here was for a couple of reasons. One is that this land was near the interurban system. It was a light rail system that connected Rochester to downtown Detroit. In addition, they needed a place where they could raise the animals where they did most of their testing. The barns behind me indicate where the horses were first located. In 1907, they started with 200 horses that were housed here in these barns. That eventually increased to 600 horses here. The reason why Parke-Davis utilized horses were for a couple of reasons. Horses' blood is very similar to human blood, and what they would do is inject horses with some of the diseases and have the horse's body fight the diseases, and then they would withdraw the blood and ship it down to Detroit to be made into the antitoxins. And so here in this facility where these barns are located, or where the horses were located here, where they developed vaccines for polio, for smallpox, for tetanus, and a variety of other childhood diseases too. And so we would like to walk through some of these buildings with you. You can also notice some of the outstanding architectural details in these barn buildings. It shows you how valuable the animals were. They said that the animals here were the best treated animals in the world. They were housed in well-ventilated buildings. They were probably the best fed animals in the world, and they were exercised every single day. One of the interesting details about these agricultural buildings is that each of the buildings was tied into water and sewer, and none of the hay used for the animals was actually stored inside the buildings. They were separated so that the horses would never be exposed to either the dust or the vermin that were associated with the hay. I'd like to take you inside where we can look at some of the architectural details inside the buildings. Follow me. Horses for the farm came from a couple different places. They had both heavy horses and light horses. The heavy horses came from St. Louis and Kansas City. The light horses came from Kentucky. The number one horse they talk about over and over again is a horse named Tess. Tess yielded over 1,000 quarts of antitoxins just for tetanus. And at one point, she was actually placed on a float and taken down Main Street in Rochester for one of the Christmas parades. Inside some of the pens here, you can see some of the workmanship and the nice wood that was placed in here. There's also wooden floors here that I'm sure were much easier on the horse's hooves. There's also lots of concrete that would make it a lot easier to clean some of these stalls. Some of the record keeping for the experiments they did here were actually written on some of the stalls here, and I'd like to take you to see some of those stalls. You can see where some of the workers were indicating the work that they were doing inside the stalls here. You can see that the flu vaccine was administered on Halloween of 1958, and all the other record keeping they did, and then all the different recordings that they did of some of the work in the stall. But this is just one general stall. We'd like to take it to where some of the more specific scientific experiments took place on this farm. One of the more important rooms in the whole operation here was this room, and it's here where horses would be strapped in, their blood would be withdrawn, and then that blood would be shipped down to Detroit at the Parke-Davis laboratories there where it would be developed into serums. We'd like to thank the Letica Corporation for giving us an opportunity to do this program, to peek inside some of these beautiful buildings. These were important not only in the development of medical facilities, but also in the development of the Rochester area. Parke-Davis Farm is just one of many large farms in the Rochester area. We had the Great Oak Stock Farm, the Meadowbrook Farm, the Ferrymore Seed Farm, the Van Hoosen Dairy Farm. If you know of information about any of these farms that you'd like to share with us through diaries or photographs, contact me at the museum. We'd be delighted to talk to you and find out what you know about some of our history from the past.
And they walked around doing the keys. And I remember they'd make their rounds, come back and have a cup of coffee, get up and make their rounds again. That was security.
I think a lot of the best security we had is because we all knew each other. If I saw somebody that didn't belong there, I knew that that person didn't belong in this plant, you know. Get them out of there. But that didn't happen often. But like I say, everybody knew each other. I knew Dr. Beardmore. Everybody. I knew everybody in this room, except the gentleman from Detroit. I didn't know him. I have the pleasure now.
I could call a mechanic, I could call growers 2 o'clock on a Sunday morning in the middle of a snowstorm. He said, we've got a problem with driver 4, and the Lewis is in his car, and it wouldn't work. We had a lot of guys like that. It was a good bunch of
It was much more than a Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 job, wasn't it?
What I couldn't understand after I retired, and I tried to tell my wife how to work more efficiently around the house, she didn't seem to appreciate my experience at all.